Wiggle, 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 wiggle.
Matt Salusbury is a young man from Pickering. In his spare time, he is a murderer. And he is here today to talk about the time he stole Robocop 2's bike from behind Loughborough Polytechnic whilst he was attending a course in socialism.
Thank you. My name is Matt Salusbury. I'm a journalist, freelance journalist and editor of a magazine about English language teaching. In March, I took 2 weeks holiday and went to India to follow up some reports about pygmy elephants. There's my Indian Railways ticket. A more accurate title for this talk would be Slightly Smaller Elephants Possibly, but not quite such a good ring to it. May I have the next slide, please? Were any of you at my talk 2 years ago about pygmy elephants? Well, anyway, since then I've been busy. Here's a sneak preview of a forthcoming book from CSA called Pygmy Elephants by myself, which will be published as soon as I get around to writing it. Some of the things I've come across recently, that's a dwarf elephant of Gabon. As you can see, it's in French. That's from Nature, the French magazine from the Museum of Natural History, 1950. Unfortunately, as for many of the alleged pygmy elephants, there's subsequently been a DNA analysis of the bones that were sent to the Natural History Museum in Paris from this specimen. And there was a work called Evolutionary Status of the So-Called African Pygmy Elephant by Regis de Bruyn and his colleagues, and that proved conclusively bog standard forest elephant, that one. Sorry, next slide please. That's recently gone on show in an exhibit called the Mammoth Site in North Dakota. That's a pygmy mammoth. Based on what I can see from the height of the door and the height of the display, that's just under 6 foot, I would say. That was on the Channel Islands, not the Channel Islands of France, but the Channel Islands of Santa Barbara in California. Dwarf version of a Colombian mammoth, which we think wouldn't have fur. And so, as you can see, it's running without bending its legs. We think something of that height probably would still have the pillar-like legs of the bigger elephants. Next slide, please. Very recently, I've been looking into P.T. Barnum Bailey Circus, which claimed to have several pygmy elephants. There's a report from the New York Times about the very small elephant. Interestingly, one of the very few cases of somebody claiming there's a pygmy elephant from India. I'm almost certain that all the pygmy elephants that P.T. Barnum was advertising were just baby elephants. And when they got bigger, they disappeared or were possibly rebranded as other elephants, given different names. I heard from one of the people you're about to see a picture of, wildlife photographer in India, who told me that when it became illegal to use tigers in circuses, all the tigers suddenly became immortal. Because when they died, there'd be a mysteriously similar tiger with a different name. And basically, they were still capturing tigers and passing them off as the original tigers that they had. So these pygmy elephants of P.T. Barnum circus, some of which came from Africa, some of which came from India, were used as clowns. They were called trick elephants, clown elephants, and almost certainly babies. Certainly the tricks they were doing, like walking upright, would suggest that they're baby elephants, which are much more agile. Sneak preview from the Pygmy Elephants book. It's an artist's impression of the mammoth graveyard in Wrangel Island off Siberia. That's, we think, one of the last places where there were mammoths. they were probably all finished off as the sea level rose. There's a bit of a debate as to whether they were getting smaller before they died. It seems that probably they and other mammoth populations, but not all other mammoth populations, towards the end of the reign of the mammoths, were shrinking in size, which is kind of interesting. It suggests that there's a sort of tendency towards getting smaller in some elephant populations. Now we go to Kerala State, southern India. After getting interested in newspaper reports in the local regional press of southern India, the English language press, like newspapers like the Hindu, they were reporting sightings of pygmy elephants. Reports were from about 2005 onwards, but it was said that in the traditions of the Carney tribal forest people, who we'll see more of later, that there'd been this pygmy elephant called Kalana around, and was said to be 5 foot high or shorter and very nimble. It could run over the rocks in a very fast way, which is why it's called Kalana, which means in the local language the stone elephant. As you can see, elephants feature in the coat of arms of Kerala. This is on a bus, Kerala Road Transport Corporation, and it's based on the arms of the Maharaja of Travancore, which was the princely state before independence. This is Trivandrum. Like Woolsbury, or Woolfordisworthy, it's got two names. The full name is Thiruvananthapuram, which is quite hard to pronounce, so it's generally known as Trivandrum. Probably India's most laid-back state capital. Kerala's in the south of India. If you imagine India this kind of shape, like a cone shape, on the west coast, near the bottom you've got Kerala. Got to go a bit further up. Relative backwater economically, tourism is big, and part of the attraction of this trip, this expedition, reconnaissance, whatever you want to call it, is the alleged cryptid was sort of an hour's drive away from the airport, so it wasn't like hacking your way through the jungle for 3 months. It's a bit like if you go to Brighton and there's some alleged mystery animal in the South Downs. Quite easy to get to, so if you're taking 2 weeks off work, doable. Anyway, there it is. Next one. I was there just when the election was happening in Kerala for the state legislature. Quite surprised to find that the state government of Kerala has been a left front dominated by a communist party for some time. It actually has a reputation as a kind of model state government. It's got one of the highest literacy rates in India per capita income, is quite high. So it's a bit unexpected to run into that. That is in Trivandrum at the porch of the temple. And if you've seen the current Fortean Times, you may have seen how the Supreme Court and the state went in to check the strong room, the treasure room underneath the temple, and found billions in gold, sacks of diamonds, sacks of rubies. It's a very ancient temple, thousands of years old, but this was added on about 200 years ago in the zenith of the power of the Maharajas of Travancore. As you can see, it's some kind of sort of elephant-like creature, which I'm told is called a makara. They're not exclusive to India, and it combines an elephant with features of lions. You've got the lion-like claws, and features of a horse. Parts of the body are quite horse-like, and it's got this kind of comb or crest on the top. And some of the ones inside the palace over the road, Maharaja's palace, which you weren't allowed to photograph in, they had this sort of row of tusks coming out of all where their teeth sockets would be like some enormous monster prawn's mouth parts. I found out that the woodwork on the inside of the palace, and we think probably that part of the temple. I couldn't get into the temple because it's forbidden for non-Tibetese people who aren't Hindus. But I was allowed to see the outside. That was made probably by craftsmen from Tamil Nadu, the neighbouring state, brought in from the neighbouring state, as I say, the early 18th century. And I was interested. I was going to look at these report sightings of pygmy elephants, and there was this tradition locally about this small elephant. And what do you see? You see this monster elephant-like creature with what was described by the temple guardian as a baby elephant reaching up to its trunk. The sort of elephant part of it was very anatomically correct, but there seems to be some strange thing going on with this Makara creature and this baby elephant. I wonder if that had anything to do with the traditions about this small elephant, whether it was relevant at all. It seems that this is some sort of heraldic device that was created around the time that Travancore was dealing with the Western powers for the first time. He needed some kind of distinctive heraldic device. And it's been pointed out that some of the mythical creatures in China, and it has this sort of strangely Chinese, almost Indonesian look to it. Some of these mythical creatures in China started out as ordinary animals, but various families needed to have a distinctive emblem, so they added bits onto animals to make them fantastic. And I understand, maybe Richard could help us here, there was some kind of stylized figure from Japan. Yeah. Does that look anything like that?
It does, quite a bit.
Yeah.
It's almost certainly based on Japanese travellers bringing back stories of the Malayan tapir. It's supposed to wander around at night and feed on people's nightmares.
Yeah. Anyway, there it is. Apparently not exclusive to India, and it also, when I went to the neighbouring state of Karnataka, to Bangalore, I noticed that the state of Karnataka had this as an emblem. I don't know if that is as relevant to the traditions of a small elephant, a kalana, or not. Next slide, please. There it is again. Sorry about the blurry picture. There's the baby elephant reaching up to the trunk of the Makara. Okay. Next one. And there, over the road, is another. That one's made of wood. That's another Makara on the Marquis of Travancore's palace. Again, done by craftsmen from Tamil Nadu about 200 years ago. Next. Sali Palodi came all that way to see him, basically. He is an amateur photographer. He is a drawing teacher in a government school in Palodi, which is in the mountains about an hour out of town from the capital of the state, Trivandrum. And he grew up on the edge of the forest with the Kani, which are tribal forest people. They're the only people who are allowed to live in the forest, and access to them is restricted. He grew up with them, and he also grew up drawing the wildlife. Around about 25 years ago, he began to beg or borrow photograph equipment and started photographing them. And all the modern reports of the Kalana, this alleged 5-foot pygmy elephant, feature him. He's taken all the photographs that we've got. And he's being interviewed there in the Trivandrum Press Club. As you can see, there's a retired journalist in the background. So when we were interviewed, we were interrupted a little bit by old journalists coming in to have a chat. I interviewed him. He seemed entirely sincere, and he described how about 25 years ago he was on a trek to the top of Agastya Mala, which is the nearby mountain on the border with Tamil Nadu and Kerala, highest peak in southern India, with his friend Malam Kani, a Kani tribal tracker who we're about to see a picture of, and saw these piles of elephant dung, except the dung was smaller. And he said, what's that? He said, oh, that's Kalana. That's the pygmy elephant. And since then, he was hooked on the idea of tracking this thing. I spoke to Sakuma Raman, who we'll meet later, who's the expert on elephant ecology in the world, certainly Asian elephant ecology, and he said the obvious thing is that, well, young elephants produced smaller balls of dung. So that may well be just young elephants. He described, as well as being small, about 5 foot high, possibly smaller, he described the distinctive things about the Kalana, that it has these ridges on its head, which we'll see some of later, and he said that was an indication that they were not juveniles but adult. They're very wrinkled in a way which he said that adult elephants aren't. He came across a dead female which he says has nipples, which he said that young elephants don't. Now I ran this past a couple of elephant experts when I was out there, and they said those are all features you also see on young elephants. A lot of people in various regions of India are very proud of their elephants. In Kerala you have a lot of elephants that are used in these festivals, these elephant festivals, which has grown in size. The festivals have become much bigger with much more elephants in the last 10 years or so, and some of the elephants are brought in from up north, from Bihar, to fuel the demand for bigger and bigger elephant festivals. And the people of different parts of India have ideas about their elephants being distinct. Like in Kerala they say our elephants have got bigger heads, and in Bihar they say our elephants are hairier. And I ran this past Sakuma Raman, elephant ecologist, and Jacob Chira, an elephant vet for many years. You're about to see him. He's saying, well, there really isn't any basis to this. The only thing you can say about regional diversity in elephants is that one thing Bihar have got bigger necks, because we made radio collars to track elephants in Kerala. We couldn't fit them on the necks of the Bihari elephants. Basically, it seems that a lot of received wisdom about what people say about their elephants has the status of information told to you by the man in the pub. There doesn't seem to be any basis in that. But as we'll see, there are elements of the Kalana which you can't just attribute to them being young elephants, as we'll see later. Next slide, please. This is Bala Madhavan, who's a wildlife photographer. Wildlife photography has really taken off in India because you've got, especially in cities like Bangalore, which are still quite close to the jungle, a lot of IT yuppies who've got a 5-day week. They don't work 6 days like most people, with a lot of money. And there's an industry of photographer guides taking these people out on trips to take pictures. And there's quite an industry which has suddenly started like that. And Sally, for example, makes some money when he can, because he has a 5-day week as a teacher, taking people out on trips. But all the money he's made so far, and all the money from the 70 photography awards he's got for his wildlife photography, including Wildlife Photographer of the Year in India 1 year, have all gone into some very flashy kit, better photographs, as you will shortly see. Anyway, I interviewed Sali. I should say that Sali speaks very little English. He speaks Malayalam, the official language of Kerala, which you're about to hear, and that Balan was interpreting. And I think in some cases, I think because Balan has a bit more of a forceful personality, it's more cosmopolitan, regularly goes to New York and London. I think he was speaking for Sali, possibly putting a bit more of a spin on what he was saying. Well, as a journalist, I have to say that. Can we go to the audio file? And there should be a little clip. Just hear a few seconds, maybe 30 seconds at the beginning of the Lost RAV person. When he comes back, we'll play a little clip of the interview, which is in. Then we have there should be a folder called interviews. You just hear me introducing the interview, and then you'll hear what Malayalam sounds like, and you'll hear the voices of Sally and...
Okay. Let me take the march interview with Sally Balodi. Barnum, it's everything. I have a list of questions. So Sally, you grew up in Balodi on the edge of the forest. And with Pakani people living there? And you work with them?
So that's Malayalam. As you can hear, Balan, much more forceful, Sally quite quiet, quite retiring. Anyway, I interviewed him. Next slide, please. Sorry about the blurry photograph. I also talked to Jacob Chiram, who's retired now, but he's the foremost vet, elephant vet in India. He pioneered a lot of techniques for administering hypodermics to elephants. He wasn't very, I didn't want to talk about it very much, but he patented a sort of shoulder-mounted hypodermic bazooka for firing into the skins of elephants some time ago. A lot of the information turned out to be a bit out of date because he hasn't been in the business very long. He also told me about the 8-page form which anyone who keeps a domestic elephant or a captive elephant, because all elephants are capped in India. It's been illegal to capture elephants since 1978, but there are some old pit traps that they occasionally fall into because no one knows where the traps are. And you do get some young or orphaned elephants in distress turning up, and we'll see some of these later. Anyway, Jacob described the 8-page form, registration certificate for a captive elephant, which has details of the microchip the elephants have. All the captive elephants are microchipped. It has a section on the form, a tick box form saying general temperament: aggressive, violent, aggressive, controllable, timid, docile, affectionate. And it has a section called record of running amok. But it actually does happen rather a lot, because you've got these huge elephant festivals. The biggest is in Thrissur, with maybe dozens of elephants, some of which are on heat, in mushed. The male elephants go into some kind of scary on-heat episode called mushed. Some of the mahouts come from Bihar, don't speak Malayalam. They're giving directions in Hindi. There's a bit of confusion in translation. It's hot, it's August, and there's lots of people banging drums. So, something's going to go wrong. And when one of them goes amok, they just throw people around in the air like dolls, and it's horrible, but it makes the bull runners Pampalona like a picnic. And they're getting bigger and bigger. But anyway, he was the vet of this bigger and bigger parade elephant industry. He said a couple of interesting things. He said newspapermen want their scoop about some of the journalists in the local press who were interviewing Sally Balodi on the occasions when he's seducing another pygmy elephant were kind of picking it up to make it sound more interesting. He also said that when these reports of a pygmy elephant in Kerala came in, he got people writing to him or friends calling him from Orissa and West Bengal, up in the north of India, also mountainous regions. You've got the Western Ghats Mountains going through Kerala, and this place where the alleged pygmy elephant is on the slopes of the mountain, on the foothills. He said that reports came in from Orissa and from West Bengal, that people saying, yeah, we've got small elephants there, which he thought was just confirmation that there wasn't really anything going on. Just thought that maybe people saw small elephants and assumed that they were some kind of big elephant when they weren't. Anyway, I don't know what to make of his statement, I'll just report it. Next one, please. This is Professor Sukumar Raman of the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, which is this enormous campus that had its own airstrip. And when I went there, they were dismantling a sort of Nero-era particle accelerator, which looked like something out of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, sort of 1950s Indian steampunk thing. He is the expert on Asian elephant ecology and genetics for the world. He is the authority. Had a long chat with him. He says you have to keep an open mind. As a scientist, you can't rule out the possibility there may be big elephants in Kerala. He described a lot of the characteristics, these ridges on the head, the wrinkles, the nipples, as being quite consistent with young elephants. He also notes that you have occasions when you'll have a group of elephants playing together, running around, looking like they're a sort of herd of small elephants, but in fact they're young elephants on some kind of play group, and they're maybe a few hundred meters away from the herd, which is just out of sight. Or you'll have the herd in the forest, keeping an eye on this herd outside the forest on the edge, but really you're not seeing a herd of big elephants, you're seeing a herd of young elephants with the bigger elephants of scale just out of sight. Now the problem with that is, as we'll see, I met this guy, Malam Karni, the tracker, and he would suddenly stop and say, "Whoa, gua, gua," which is a kind of wild bison, and he'd disappear, and they'd come stampeding along a few minutes later. If there was some kind of play group of elephants and a big group of adult elephants just out of sight, he'd know about it. I'm quite certain. So me and Sakuma discussing this, thought that was unlikely. He's done, or has been part of the big genetic surveys of Indian and Burmese elephant populations. Burmese elephants are the same species, very closely related. He said it's surprising, even in isolated areas where you've got these, maybe you've got about 100 isolated populations of elephants now that have no genetic interchange, they're all in reserves. He said it's surprising how genetically diverse they still are. And the genetic diversity of elephants is quite healthy. So the idea that you've got some little population which has got some sort of mutation that makes it smaller, he ruled it out pretty much. He did note that in Burma, the elephants are slightly smaller, ever so slightly smaller, because they're in thick forest. And as we'll see, the place where the pygmy elephants are alleged to be in the Alpapara is a very thick forest. And he suggested that there might be this family of slightly smaller individuals. And while Balam Madhavan was stressing the need to go out and collect dung and collect little bits of hair that you might find in DNA analysis, he said don't bother, because what they may be seeing is a family of slightly smaller individuals, and a DNA analysis wouldn't really show anything up, and if there was such a family, they will probably breed out, because while it's, we think, an isolated reserve where these elephants live, they go out of the reserve and they go all out west and get out of the state they need to go. So that's, he was quite open. He also said in 2009, him and his team were getting ready to go with the Kerala Wildlife and Forest Service to do a survey of the elephants, specifically to look for this animal, the koala, to interview the locals and to take dung samples. But the rains in January were unexpectedly heavy, and it was rained off. And his considerable academic commitments mean he couldn't follow it up. I should say, during the interview, he was getting presented with applications to go on leave from his department and paper requisitions and all sorts of academic admin. And also the most bizarre marketing call I've ever heard from a mobile phone company about these 2 SIM cards that he had. And did he want free weekend calls on the SIM cards? And he said, tried to explain, no. The 2 SIM cards are in storage in radio collars to be used on elephants. So the SIM cards will be used exclusively for transmitting the position of the elephants on GPS, and no thank you, they don't want weekend calls for free. Anyway, that was Bangalore. Next one, please. There's a lot of waiting around in India. It's always a lot more complicated than it looks, and particularly when you're dealing with people who have a day job, who really can't, they can't just drop everything and get a day off teaching, so I had to wait around for a bit. And I decided to go up north to the Kodondad elephant camp on the River Pylya. These are rescued elephants. They come out of the forest in distress as very young elephants. They're being trained by mahouts. Some of them will be on these elephant parades, others will be used to take tourists around or for other duties by the Forest Service. There they are going for a bath. I had a chance to look at them to compare young captive elephants with these alleged small adult elephants. Next slide, please. As you can see, the mahout is controlling this enormous big beast weighing several tons just by gently pulling its tail. Next one. This one here must be at least 9 foot high, 8 foot high, 9 foot high I would say, in his late teens. The time I became aware of it was when somebody behind me touched me on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me please," and it was right behind me. We'd imagine elephants to be this big thing with trumpets and makes this big thumping noise and makes the ground shake. They were absolutely silent. Next one. Elephants having a bath. You'd think young elephants love a bath, they absolutely hate it. They were trumpeting and all the rest of it. The older ones are a bit more used to it. They're getting scrubbed with coconut husk because they pick up quite a lot of parasites when they're in captivity. Next one. It looks like some enormous monster squid. You look at his head, but it's an elephant. Next one. Splashy, splashy. Next one. Here we are in the Upper Wildlife Sanctuary. Not a particularly big reserve, nothing particularly exotic, not a lot of tourism. In fact, there are no tourists there. You need permission to go in. It's forested, dense forest up in the hills near a place called Clonmody, around there, and it merges into the foothills of Agastya Mala, which is the biggest peak in South India, and also a place of pilgrimage, Hindu pilgrimage, particularly in the last 10 years. The numbers have increased, and Sali said he believes that Kalana generally lives at the top, but they're being forced down by many more people coming on the pilgrimages. We went around all these different offices in the Kerala Forest and Wildlife Department looking for the right person to talk to, and Balan, who was there in his 4x4, his agent, was saying, "Every time I come here there's more and more bosses," and I was about to say, "Too many chiefs, not enough Indians," but I refrained from doing so. And we got to talk to Shyam. I didn't get his surname. Don't really have surnames in the sense that we did. Who was the wildlife warden for that district, chief warden, and he wanted to hear what I was doing. And he gave me permission and to go in on the condition I went in with Sali and Balan, and only them. Which meant we didn't have a language in common. I'm an English teacher, so I can gesticulate a bit. But we were a bit limited in how we could converse, which was a pity. But that was the only way we would get in. I should say that it's an hour's ride from the centre of Trivandrum by motorised rickshaw. I got there in just an hour and 10 minutes. As we got out of Trivandrum, we went past one of these showrooms of the new Tata Nano, the people's car that you can get for $1,000. And the rickshaw driver was very disparaging and said that his rickshaw had a slightly higher maximum speed, about 50 kilometres an hour. You know, we got there. It is really not very far from the centre of the state capital. You know, from a cryptozoological point of view, quite an easy one. There's the edge of the forest with the sign in English and Malayalam. Not Hindi, didn't see any Hindi at all when I was there. And we're about to go through the Carney Hamlets, which is restricted, but we have permission from the Wildlife Service. Very unusual for you to be allowed to go into the Carney Hamlets. Next slide. On the left is Sali, still in his work clothes from school, in his smart sarong. He changed into his shorts later in natural colours. And on the right, sorry, Sali on the left, on the right is Malam Carney, the Carney tracker. They got some sort of Laurel and Hardy camaraderie going because they've been going out to the forest for the past 20 years together. And they walk fast. I wasn't able to take pictures, saying faster, faster, and to keep up with them. Next one. Ignore the wood for a moment. What do you think that is? What's that feature there? It's an elephant trench that's dug around the villages to stop elephants coming into the village. Okay. Next one. Elephant poo. We got these really steep gradients, and then down these really steep gradients we were single file practically on all fours, really, really difficult terrain. But these elephants were negotiating it because they've got these amazing feet that can, the soles of their feet can change their shape to different surfaces of terrain. Next one. In the Carney village, they grow a lot of their own food, they harvest the fruits of the forest. Can we identify them? What's that?
Ginger?
Good, 2 kinds of ginger. Next one. Anybody?
Yeah.
That's arrowroot, which they make into biscuits. Needs no explanation. That's a banana. This one, have a look at the shells, see if you can guess.
Cashew?
Cashew, yeah. Introduced to that part of India, now a big cash crop. Don't eat the shells, they're very poisonous. Next one. Needs no explanation. Coconuts, we have coconuts for lunch. That's a very young guava. Oh, they just planted that one, they're too young to eat. Next one. Anyone?
Breadfruit?
Yeah, I think that's jackfruit. They call it jackfruit. It could be breadfruit, which I believe is introduced from the Pacific. And I don't know if you can see it, but the elephants lick the bark. They love the bark. They were grown wild as well as being cultivated. Next one. Anybody? Mango. Mango tree. Yeah. And next one. This isn't part of his garden, but this is, you have these official forestry department low impact forestry projects where they grow cash crops with very low impact.
Via Brasiliensis. Rubber.
There's rubber, and they've got a bit of coconut to catch it. So they have these commercial crops, but they're very sort of low impact, sustainable on the edge of the forest. So now we go into the deep part of the forest where there have been 3 Kalana sightings in the past decade. I thought the likelihood of me seeing it was going to be very small indeed. Let's go on. This is the sort of gradient that we're going up, and the elephants go up at all the time. I was quite surprised, but I imagine if you were a slightly smaller elephant, then negotiating these slopes might be slightly easier. Anyway, next one. That's how thick the forest is. One point we were walking along and they said, keep up, keep up. I had a thorn impaled into my ear, which I was pulling out. It was really, really tough, and 80% humidity. I was practically fainting, it was so humid and close. And quite high altitude, you suddenly become aware you're in the mountains and the altitude is high. Next one. Downhill again, very steep slope, the elephants do it every day. Next one. This is the lake where they've had all the sightings. I mean, I've been looking at all these alleged pygmy elephants that they shot this and they shot that, and there's this pygmy elephant that lives on the shores of Lake whatever in the Belgian Congo, as it was then. That's the only place you're going to see them. They're in the forest all the time. So all sightings are like lakes because they're in the forest. Next one. I've got a license to use this photo, and this is one of the events I got a license to use it. That is Kalana, allegedly, by Sani, taken in 2010 from about 100 foot away. So that's obviously, he's blown up that section of the picture in that lake environment you just saw. Rather annoyingly, not very much by way of scale. And he says there's ridges on the head, and the fact that it's got tusks are evidence that it's an adult. And there was something about the tail. The tail looks like a fish tail. But I looked at some of the obviously juvenile elephants having a bath that got that too. What was suggested by the elephant experts I talked to is that the elephants you see on parades during the year, if you live in that part of Kerala, are well fed, but you normally have 2 monsoons, but this part of Kerala misses 1 monsoon, so even though they're in the forest getting a better diet of leaves, they're a bit emaciated some of the year, And guess what? All the sightings were in April, which is the end of the dry season. Interesting. And he says, well, Jacob Sheeran thought that that was just an emaciated elephant, and if you were to see it in a different part of the year, it would be a bit healthier. You could refrain from photographing that because Sally has to make a living somehow. And the wrinkles again could be part of the fact that he hasn't eaten very much of late. It's got tusks, possibly quite a lot of tusk growth if it's going to be a juvenile elephant, but I came across something in Pachyderm, which is one of these elephant specialist magazines. Somebody who was a warden in Central African Republic says that when, for whatever reason, elephants leave the herd early, they're orphaned and then adopted by other elephants, you get what's called precocious tusk development. I don't quite know how it works, but when a lot of elephants get orphaned and then adopted by other elephants due to poaching and so on, they seem to have their tusk developing early. We don't quite understand this, but this does seem to be something that works. That's in African elephants, not Indian elephants though. Next one. This is the photo 2005 of the dead female that Sali and Malan Carney found by the same lake. They called the warden who certified it as dead and certified it as a young elephant, based on not much observation. It was cremated, which is standard practice. You've got this half-ton giant fermentation tank that's starting to rot away. You want to get rid of it. There were in the press reports that a DNA sample had been taken, and I tried to track this down. It turns out that it was one of these newspapermen who wanted to get a scoop, and it was someone saying, wouldn't it be a good idea if there had been a DNA sample taken? There wasn't a DNA sample taken. Next slide. That's the photo, and you compare it with the live juvenile elephant in the same position, the eye photograph. It does look rather similar, and these ridges on the head seem to be common to both of them. It's looking awfully like a misidentified juvenile elephant. Next one. On the left is Sali with his the profits of his photography invested in that Canon lens. And on the right is Malan Carney. That's the spot where they found the female dead alleged pygmy elephant in 2005. Next one. That's me, much the worse for wear. That wet look on my shirt is me sweating. It was really quite grueling. I took my passport with me and it turned into papier-mâché at the end. But Her Majesty's passport, so it seems to be using magic paper. It was back to normal the next day. And we were finished in time for lunch. That's how near it is to the big city. And you're probably going to say, well, didn't you go back again? Well, given that they've had 3 sightings in a decade, and one of them can't get off work, and they didn't have a common language, and they had to go all the way back to the Forest Department to get a translator, and I thought that was probably the best I was going to be able to do. Next one. There's the lake, and you can see Malan Carney standing there 100 foot away, so that's the distance they saw that first male elephant with tusks, Asian elephants, only the males had tusks, in 2010. So that photo you saw earlier was obviously zooming in, but that's reenacting the sighting of the tusker, the male alleged Kalana in 2010. Next one. There you see Sali at work, getting ready, because a few minutes before Malan's said there's some koala out there. I couldn't hear anything, but he picked up some sign. We'd walk on and he'd stop and say, listen, and he'd say the name of a bird. He knew the word names of some of the birds in English. I couldn't hear anything, and then you hear it. So, very good at his job. Which makes me think, if there are elephants playing away from a herd a few yards away, he'd know about it. Anyway, there is Sali crouching as we can just hear a herd of gaur thundering towards us. Next one. That's our close encounter with a herd of gaur, which are wild forest buffalo. Because we didn't have a common language apart from a few words, I didn't really know what was going on, except that Sally seemed to be crouching down with his camera, and they came running towards us, and I was behind some trees, and I thought, I'm staying behind these trees. And then Sally gets up and runs. I thought, I'm staying here, but he's running towards us to take a picture. And they veered away. And I, of course, tried to get up, but I was pinned by thorns, so I wasn't able to. But this is the sort of photography that Sally does. Action photography like this. Next one. Oh, yes. That's a tree crab. That's from his website, Sally below the website. He says there are tree crabs in the nature reserve as well, and some exotic tarantulas. I don't know whether they're known to science or not, but he insists there's a tree crab, and there's a picture of it. He was a bit unclear about the size, I think, because he didn't have a common language. Not particularly big, he said. And I said, are they near water? He said, not particularly. There are some trees. I don't know what to make of that. I didn't have enough information, and we didn't really have a great deal of time to go into detail about the tree crab because we spent so long on the elephants in the interview. Next one. And that's Sally Peloni's drawing, which he did when I asked him to, in my notebook in the forest. That's his drawing of the tree crab from memory. So, what are we to make of this? I think it's, from what I've seen, a lot of these characteristics which Sally Peloni was describing as that of an adult but smaller elephant are also common to some elephants. A lot of people don't realise that there's a great deal of variety in the way elephants can appear. And if you've only seen them on parades or that kind of environment, you haven't really seen them up close in the wild, you might not be aware that that's entirely within the range of what they look like. I think it seems possible that... Sorry, that's my not to take questions alarm, so we'll be seeing. It seems possible that in very dense forest environments, like the one we saw, we also heard about the elephants in Burma, that there may be a tendency for elephants to get smaller. That you see that it becomes a bit of an adaptation to be ever so slightly smaller in a very dense forest environment like you have there. So there may be the odd family of small individuals going around. We don't know whether that's going to breed out in the general population because there seems to be quite a healthy population in that reserve. The last survey, they extrapolated mostly from doing mathematics on the piles of dung they found, but also on sightings that there's at least 20 adults. But you may have at least another 20 or more outside the reserve because they move around a bit. It's like when a State Wildlife Service of Kerala does their survey of elephants in Kerala, half the elephants in that group may be over the border in Tamil Nadu. Also, when I talked to Sakuma Raman, the professor in Bangalore, he said that he started hearing reports of Kalana about 25 years ago from media reports from Tamil Nadu, and that these reports kind of came over the border into Kerala. And because I didn't have a common language to go into great detail, I wasn't able to find out how old this tradition of Kalana is, whether it's an ancient tradition or whether the Kani, along with everyone else in Kerala, has picked it up from newspaper reports in the last 20 years. So we don't even know how old this tradition. But, so anyway, it seems to be slightly small elephants. Also didn't have the resources to go into much more than that. But anyway, when it gets written, which will hopefully be soon, there'll be more detail in my forthcoming book, Pygmy Elephants. Another thing I should point out, because it's funny, when I went to the Kodondad elephant camp, I then went to an elephant rescue centre where they had not just elephants, but the elephants weren't in yet, they were getting their accommodation ready. There were these big enclosed forest areas for the various rescued animals to roam, including muntjac, these dwarf deer. And they said, we've got elephants, we've got peacocks, we've got crocodiles, we've got these macaque monkeys, and we've got the impossibly exotic dwarf muntjac deer. And I said, exotic? I mean, I go to Suffolk a lot and they're vermin. You know, they've got them on the menu in cafes on the A12 because they're culling them because they're a menace. And the guy who was running the place was a bit interested in this and said, well, that is the consequence of your folly. And he said, what do you mean by that? Well, you invaded India, you've got all these muntjac now. Anyway, more detail on that in the forthcoming Pygmy Elephants book. If anyone later in the evening is going towards Hyde Valley, a lift would be nice. And in the B&B where I'm staying now, I don't know if it's got any accommodation, they've suddenly got 2 rooms free to do a cancellation. Any questions? Yes.
Are you familiar with reports of black elephants in China with pink tusks and Tang Dynasty, which I've read about?
It's in that Flying Snake magazine that was outside, I just saw it. I was looking into forest elephants in West Africa in some detail because all the pygmy elephants reported are in the territory, in the range occupied by forest elephants that seem to be misidentified forest elephants. And apparently the ivory of the forest elephant is denser, heavier, and has a slightly pink tinge to it. Or can have. That's all I know.
I seem to recall you mentioned early stage dwarfism in the island off Siberia with a sort of one of the last relic populations of mammoths. Are there not also some fossils of Mediterranean dwarf elephants?
Yeah, I've learned that extensively. The circumstances which led to the dwarf elephants of the Mediterranean and that pygmy mammoth you saw in the Channel Islands of California, and these hobbits on Flores apparently came a bit later than another smaller pygmy elephant. There are several others. They're on islands and no predators. They swam there, but it seems that we don't have enough data to say this, but it seems that there was not just in Wrangell, but also in the last enclaved mammoths in Siberia, where there are a lot of fossils of them. Some of the later individuals, that there were proportionally more diminutive individuals, is all ever fair to say. And also there's this population just outside Moscow, which was a bit earlier, where they found what appears to be mammoths getting slightly smaller. Thanks for reminding me of that. This isn't an island. This Nyarpapa Reserve isn't really an island forest. It's not completely cut off or anything. While it seems that some, not just elephants, but other dwarf species became dwarfs very quickly, maybe within, some people think 10,000 years in some cases, these really aren't the conditions. They aren't even island forests, they're not isolated, and there are predators, there are leopards, so really not the conditions to produce these very small dwarf elephants, some 3 foot high. And they're only claiming, in the case of these alleged modern pygmy elephants, that they're about 5 foot high. They're really not that much smaller. There are what's called pygmy elephants on Borneo, which look a little bit different. World Wildlife Fund claims they're 6 inches shorter, and talked to Adrian Lister, who's an expert on elephants and mammoths, who went out with one of these rangefinders to measure them, and we couldn't find any difference between them and a mainstream, mainland Asian elephant. Oh, yes? Very right.
Okay, so I'll use one. Mammoth graveyards. There's myths of elephants graveyards in Africa and possibly in India. Do these things actually exist?
I don't know. Anyone any data on that? This is only a graveyard in that it's it's a paleontological dig, and it's over many years. There's layers.
But it's a whole bunch of bones at the same time.
The circumstances seem to be. I mean, there's a suggestion that they went to the high ground when the sea came in. That some of these inundations that made the sea level rise were very sudden, and in some cases you've got these desperate herds of mammoths getting together on the high ground and all getting drowned together, but that's a bit speculative.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Not strictly elephant related, but you mentioned Agastya, the highest peak in South India. Is that a place of pilgrimage because, in the Olympus sense, that they think it's the abode of the gods because it's the highest, or?
I forget which one it is. There are one or two. I mean, everything in Kerala is there's also a big Christian community. There's Syriac Christians, there's Catholics, there's all sorts. So there is a little bit of a Catholic pilgrim trail there. I'm afraid I haven't really looked into that.
They haven't built the Stations of the Cross, have they?
Well, I mean, it's like a lot of things. It's only got really big in the last 10 years. I think because people could travel more, people have got more disposable income. I found out when I was there that most of the sort of the pilgrimage aspect of Hinduism is apparently in that part of the world is from a religious revival that happened 200 years ago. It's not all that ancient. Whereas a lot of the monuments are very ancient, the idea of pilgrimage is quite a recent one, like 200 years old, apparently, in that part of India.
So it is predominantly a Hindu pilgrimage site?
Yes, it is. I mean, Kerala is a lot of Christians, Catholics, Syriac Christians, a lot of the lower caste or untouchables, so-called Dalit castes, tended to convert to either Islam or Christianity because, you know, the missionaries would offer them a better deal than they were going to get as the downtrodden of the caste system. So a lot of fishermen particularly are either Christian or Islamic. But to be honest, I haven't really looked into this in great detail.
Any other questions?
I think Thomas, wasn't the disciple
Hang on,
Thomas?
Richard.
Wasn't Thomas supposed to have gone to?
Yeah. The city of Cochin, and there's also a big Jewish community in Cochin as well, which is very ancient. At the end of all this, I had a quite strange experience because I arrived, went straight into Trivandrum, was the only European I could see, although everyone spoke quite good English, and went into these remote places, was just talking to forest officials, and then, because there were a few days spare, I ended up on the beach, which is this weird kind of India light where they're playing Beatles in the restaurant. I got into an and saying, "Come and play some Bollywood, please." Which is really quite odd. Even odder because Thomas Cook had abandoned this and suddenly stopped doing charter flights. So it's like one of these weird Lebanese resorts with nobody in the hotels and people fighting over a taxi fare. But there was this beach where it was 40 and 50-year-old Scandinavian academics wintering there and stuff, and some surfing. And because of the complicated Kerala alcohol laws, drinking alcoholic beer out of teacups. But just over the hill was this wasteland, as the fishermen put up their boats, and that was apparently Ophir, which is the legendary port from which King Solomon got his pearls and everything. And pepper was traded with the Roman Empire, it was completely vanished, but apparently. You've got a lot of religions coming there because from the Middle East it's not very far. 1 in 5 adult male Keralis are working in the Middle East because it's a hop, skip and a jump away. It's an hour by plane.
Any other questions? Yes, there's one back. Is that you, Carl? I can't see.
Just wondering back about the Borneo pygmy elephants, whether or not they turned out to be an indigenous species or whether or not they were introduced.
Yeah, I'm sure there's probably been somebody else arguing to the contrary, but the last thing I read was that they were introduced through elephant diplomacy. A lot of local Maharajas would gift elephants to other heads of state, and they apparently came from the Sultan of a place called Salah in the southern Philippines. now in the Philippines. They were shipped over and then escaped and swam or something. And they appear to have come from some quite isolated population of elephants that was once in the Philippines, which has now died out. And there's no archaeological evidence in Borneo for elephants before about 1800 or something. And there is this totally unofficial designation, Elephas maximus borneensis, which is dodgy. It's not accepted by science. The face looks different. The head looks a bit bigger. It looks a bit more sort of sadly comical and childlike, but not much smaller, really. A distinct population, but I mean, pygmy. The designation pygmy was invented by the wildlife tourism industry. Lovely.
Anybody else? Okay, if you can bring down the microphone, Greg. Have you heard about the African elephants in Salusbury? Now, I don't know how true this is, but many moons ago I was in a band with a guitarist who'd done his national service in Malaya and was somehow, he had relatives in Sarawak who had a rubber plantation, and he'd heard the story that one of the white writers of Sarawak in the 1920s had obtained a small family group of African elephants from somewhere and let them go in Sarawak for reasons unknown, and that somewhere in Sarawak there's a small herd of actually African elephants. Well, that sort of stuff happens more likely, more often than you know, because you know the Lizard Peninsula in Cornwall. There are Scottish blue hares there, because the brown hares were wiped out by hare coursers in by 1880, and they decided to introduce the ones which were better sport, and they're still there. Which has got nothing to do with elephants. It's the sort of thing that always amuses me about things turning up in places where they're not supposed to.
A lot of the parade elephants in Kerala, or working elephants in Kerala, are in fact from the Andaman Islands, where the logging industry down in the 60s, and some of it was picked up from there. Took to work for the forest department in Kerala.
Good Lord. That's what I love about the Weird Weekend. I always end up picking up odd snippets of completely useless information, and that's the sort of thing that keeps me happy. It's always a pleasure to have you here, Matt. Thanks for coming, and thanks for sort of coming rushing up and having to be collected at the last minute at the station and things. We really do appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, Matt Salisbury. Now, anybody who's been to the Weird Weekend before will know that there is always what is technically described as a cocker. I forgot to take the cake out of the freezer. So, the kids' tea party is going to be in the next break, not in this break. And as there aren't that many kids here, anybody here wants to join in a cake eating competition. And it's one of the best things that has ever happened to me in the whole 12 years we've been doing the Weird Weekend was the sight of Colonel John Braxton Snell joining in the cake eating competition with a bunch of 4-year-olds last year. If any adults want to come and eat far too much cake, the government are telling us that there is a rising problem with child and other obesity. Well, I don't think we're doing enough to help. So there will be a lot of free cake. It won't be until we break after this. If you guys would like to go and have a break with some really, really nice potato leek soup, which I am eating in between giving these announcements, and in half an hour's time you have the highlight of the Fortean year with the CFZ quiz. David, are you there? Let's have some music.